We are mired in the worst economy in years, some say since the Great Depression. High unemployment. In fact, in the month of June, more than 4,000 more people in Connecticut lost their jobs. The state is running at a huge deficit. Cities and towns are laying off and cutting back. With us today to talk about this is Fred Carstensen, a professor of economics at the University of Connecticut and the director of UConn's Connecticut Center of Economic Analysis. Fred, thanks for being with us today.
Delighted to be here.
Do you agree with that statement that it's the worst economy since the Great Depression, first of all?
Well, nationally, certainly.
Okay.
It looks like it, and if you benchmark it against the worst unemployment that we had in the early 80s, which was in the mid-10%, the current thinking is we're going to exceed that benchmark. It's already basically the longest recession that we've had since the Second World War, and by a lot of other measures, it clearly is the worst since the Great Depression. For Connecticut, the early 90s was significantly worse than what we've experienced so far. We hope we don't get there. We lost 10% of our jobs in the early 90s, 160,000 jobs. At this point, we've lost about 70,000. It's worse than we did in 01. But when we lost about 55 to 60,000, and we're going to lose some more. But
so it's going to get worse.
It is going to get worse, especially on the employment front. There's no disagreement about that.
Do you see businesses closing or just laying off? Or?
Well, we've had Secretary of State Bicewicz had a report out a week ago that the record number of closures in Connecticut of businesses that simply have closed up shop. You don't know whether those were inactive LLCs and they simply said we're not going to pay a fee to keep it going, or whether they were actually had employees. But we certainly have seen closures, and we've seen, you look at the retail places, their vacancies, even in relatively hot areas like West Hartford Center. Clearly there have been closures of one kind or another, and we're now seeing with the defense budget the possibility that the F-22 is going to be discontinued, and there are about 2,000 jobs, direct employment in Connecticut, that are connected with that.
But this is not a sudden thing or something that just happened last year. Your argument is that Connecticut's been on the decline since the 1980s.
We have been, and it's not just my argument. It's an argument that a number of other people have been made, and in fact, there have been 3 conferences at the Northeastern Utilities that hosted, where this has been discussed at length. We've had no job creation since the late 80s, no net new jobs. We lost jobs. We just barely regained those jobs. Then we lost jobs again. We just barely regained them. So we've gone 20 years with no net job creation. We have fewer business establishments now than we had in 1989. We have every population group is shrinking except for women over 85 and foreign-born. Our workforce is shrinking. Its qualifications are declining. We've had the largest increase in income inequality in the nation. We were the only state whose bottom 20% of household experienced a double-digit decline in their real income. And only 3 states saw any decline in real income. So every single indicator, demographics, general economic activity, employment, says Connecticut is in a long-term, gradual, competitive decline.
From a television perspective, when Denise DeCenzo started here in 1986, this was the 21st biggest television market in the country. When I started in the 90s, it was 23, fell to 26, 28. Now it's 30, expected to go to 32 or 33 in the next couple of years.
And that's part of this process. No population growth because there's no economic base to sustain it.
So the state's not attractive to new residents?
Well, the research department of the Federal Reserve has been pointing out for years that Connecticut has been losing high-pay, high-skill jobs, replacing them with low-skill, low-wage jobs.
Why is that?
It's been a systematic pattern. Well, it's multifaceted. I mean, there's no panacea here. But Connecticut has not had, now we will see in the next week or so, I think, the first comprehensive economic development statement that was mandated by the legislature and signed by the governor a couple years ago, and I know the draft is, I think, now at the governor's office, and we'll see what that... But we haven't had any economic development strategy. We don't invest in marketing. There was an analysis done of the New England states as a whole 4 years ago. New England as a region was sort of characterized as one the region that has the most and does the least. We have fabulous assets, but we don't collaborate, we don't coordinate, we don't work collaboratively. We have the weakest governors association in the country. We have these fabulous assets.
One of the worst transportation systems in our state.
Very poor transportation system.
What's bad about it?
Well, an over-reliance on the automobile, underinvestment in public transportation. It's difficult for people to get their jobs except by driving.
I know our good friend Tom Condon at the Hartford Courant has argued against sprawl for a long time. You still see companies moving to these suburban office parks where there is no public transportation.
Right, like this television station.
That would be an example.
But there are a lot of things that drive that. I mean, partly the tax environment, partly the incentives that are in place, partly the way the financial markets work, the ability to create new buildings.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll look for some solutions when we come back with Fred Carson after this commercial timeout. What do we do to reverse these trends in our state? What can the governor and the Democrats do?
Well, and that is the challenge, getting beyond the current crisis is very real and to which we have to respond. But down the pike, we're going to have a permanent fiscal crisis if we don't change these trend lines, because we're not going to have a healthy enough economy to generate the revenues to support the public services.
So getting a budget agreement is just a Band-Aid, really?
It's a Band-Aid, and currently they're tinkering around the edges with a very bad revenue system and so on. So on the revenue side, we need to really restructure how we collect taxes in Connecticut. The current system that we have is really dysfunctional, and no matter what you do with the current system, it's going to have problems down the pike.
How do you fix it?
Well, on the revenue structure, I just co-authored a piece that talked about having a much lower sales tax that's across the board. It actually generates much more revenue, and now people would immediately say, you're going to put a sales tax on food and clothing, and my answer is yes, absolutely, and we're going to give every taxpayer a rebate that covers a basic food budget and a basic clothing budget. So you take out the regressivity of it, but everybody is on the same playing field. See, the current sales tax is on a progressively narrower base. I looked at the data before this collapse, and the sales tax collections had declined by $375 million in a growing economy because it's on a discretionary spending, and we kept putting in exclusions and credits and so on, and so we were systematically eroding our base.
Big problem, of course, young people do not want to stay in this state when they graduate from college. They don't want to move here if they've graduated from someplace else, and some say it's because there's no real strong city that has attractions for them.
Well, see, I disagree with that. We've done a lot of tracking. In fact, Connecticut is the only state in the country that had an analysis that tracked every high school sophomore that took the CAP exam between '96 and 2000, tracked them through college, tracked them into the workforce. We actually know whether they ever worked here, what kind of jobs they had, how long they stayed. And there is a tremendous problem with out-migration.
The brain drain.
But the brain drain. But if you've been to a West Hartford Center, which is one of the most vibrant ones, you see the enormous revival in New Haven, around the Green and so on, and President Levin at Yale has done a fabulous job down there. They've got over 1,000 people now at Yale who now live in the city of New Haven because of the incentives on paying part of the property tax that Yale had made for 10 years. They'll pay $2,000 a year. They snapped up the Bayer Research Campus, so, you know, bring your lab coat and your microscope and go to work. I mean, it's a fabulous kind of initiative that we've seen down there. The real problem is, you take your first job in Connecticut. You know, you graduate from any of our fine institutions of higher education. You take your first job in Connecticut as a professional. You're in a position for 3 years. Now you want to move up. Connecticut has a decreasing number of opportunities to move up by staying in Connecticut. If you want to grow professionally, you have to leave. It's not... I have not seen persuasive evidence that says that people are moving out after their first 2 or 3 years working here because they don't want to stay here. They move out because, just as a matter of professional development.
Yeah. Although there are some big companies here with some high-paying jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, we hear from a lot of people, oh, I want to be in Boston with a sports team. I want to be able to walk out of my office and then go to the bars and go to the shopping. I don't have to drive to West Hartford to shop and South Windsor to do this and downtown Hartford for a concert. I want it all in one spot.
You're absolutely right. There is an enormous appeal to a lot of people of this urban environment. And of course, that's why Blueback Square has been so successful. It is an urban environment. You can live
to a degree, though. I mean,
to a degree.
I mean, it's a great place, but you know, what I mean,
but Stamford has been very successful generating with downtown housing. There's a tremendous stock of quality downtown housing, and people walk to work.
Fred Carstensen from UConn, thank you so much for being with us.